Right. Welcome to our lesson today on types of movement. We're going to have a look at the basic types of movement. There's going to be 8. We're going to try and sort of relate them to the planes. Okay. We might briefly discuss axis, but really, so types of movement is the first thing we need to do. Identify the 8, so name them, then define them. Okay, so you have to say, describe what they actually mean. And then also we need to try and apply it to a sporting action, okay, or a sort of physical action, okay. So let's start. So to start with, I'll just work on frontal plane movements that occur. Okay, so we covered this in a lesson previous. So I'll just go over them again. So any kind of movement you can see in the frontal plane, okay, simply as abduction, adduction. Now, abduction is the movement of a limb away from the midline of the body. So the midline of the body is, if you draw a line from the middle of the head all the way down to between my feet, that's the midline of the body. So if you take a limb away from the midline of the body, you're abducting the arm away from that midline of the body. The movement of a limb away from the midline of the body. Okay, so that's abduction. Now, abduction can happen at the shoulder, and it can also happen at the hip. Okay, so abduction of the hip, abduction of the shoulder. Okay, then you've got adduction, so the opposite. So adduction is the movement of a limb towards the midline of the body. Okay, so it's from there to there. It could even be from up top here all the way to there. Okay, so that would be the adduction of the shoulder, and then the same thing would be starting here out. So adduction of the hip would be bringing it towards the midline of the body. Okay, bringing it towards the midline of the body. Okay, so that's abduction and adduction. So they're the only movements you can really see in the frontal plane. Okay, there are different movements as well, but we're not looking at those really at GCSE PE level. If I stand side on now, you should hopefully by now know what plane of movement we're looking at. Okay, just think about it. Starts with an S, ends with an L. Sagittal. This is the sagittal plane. So all the movements that you can see in the sagittal plane are generally flexion and extension. Okay, so let's have a quick look. We'll work from the shoulders, we'll work downwards. Okay, so shoulder flexion would be raising the arm up. That would be shoulder flexion. Okay, you could go all the way up. And shoulder extension would be bringing the arm back down. So from there to there, that would be shoulder extension. Okay, so what you need to start doing already is start thinking about different sports in which, okay, these kinds of movements occur. All right, so that's flexion extension of the shoulder, flexion and extension of the hip. So flexion of the hip is that. Okay, so think about a sprinter. Okay, flexion of the hip, and then extension, okay, of the hip is when you bring the hip down. So flexion of the hip is moving up. Okay, so its definition of flexion is reducing the angle at a joint. Okay, so that would there be 180, that would be 90, that would be 45, reducing the angle at a joint. Okay, same thing here, that would be 180, that would be 90, okay, and that would be 45. So you're reducing the angle at the joint. So that's hip flexion, hip extension. Okay, and then finally, if you can see my ankles, okay, you've got dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, and then the opposite would be dorsiflexion if you bring the toes towards your shin. So the definitions of plantar flexion and dorsiflexion are: plantar flexion is the movement at the ankle which increases the angle. Okay, the movement at the ankle that increases the angle. Okay, that there's plantar flexion. The angle at the ankle joint is increasing. So that would be 90 degrees. Okay, and that would be larger. That would be 120 degrees. Okay, then you've got the opposite would be bringing the toes back towards your shin. Okay, and that's called dorsiflexion. Now the definition of dorsiflexion is you're reducing the angle. The movement at the ankle where you're reducing the angle at the ankle. All right. Okay, so those are all the different. So sagittal plane is just flexion extension. Think about the joints. Just work your way down from shoulder to hip to knee. Sorry, I haven't done knee flexion and knee extension. Knee flexion, knee extension. Okay, so the 4 joints. All right, and then finally, what we have a look at is the last plane that we have is the transverse plane, which is from above. Okay, and the kinds of movement that you would have going on there would be anything like that. Okay, so that's a rotation. Okay, that's called rotation, and generally you have rotation, that would be the longitudinal axis. So the definition of rotation is movement around a longitudinal axis. Okay, that's rotation. So it could potentially be movement around the spine. So the longitudinal axis would be the spine. The longitudinal axis here is my humerus bone. Okay, and that happens a lot in sport. So that can happen in a top spin for tennis, and it can happen in bowling or throwing. So what happens is you get this internal rotation that happens. Okay, it's just that movement, that's rotation. Okay, one final thing you have to remember is circumduction. Okay, sorry, the car's going past. Circumduction. Okay, and that basically means a circular movement at a joint. A circular movement at a joint. So now, if you think about it, that cannot happen at a hinge joint. Okay, it can only happen at the ball and socket joints. So therefore, you've got the shoulder, and then yes, you guessed it, the hip. Okay, so you've got any circumduction would be that. Okay, potentially circumduction can also be the circular motion at the hip joint as well. Circumduction. So if you get a question about a bowler in cricket, okay, you need to mention the fact that there's circumduction, okay, because that arm's moving all the way around. Okay, it's the circular motion at the joint, and then also, okay, a bowler in cricket, they'd get there, up there, and then they'd turn the hand in. So you then have that sort of internal rotation. So you'd have circumduction and rotation. Okay, I'm jumping ahead of myself there. So we've outlined 8 different. So frontal, there's abduction, adduction, that's 2. Side on, you've got flexion, extension, that's 4. Okay, you've got plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, that's 5, 6. And then finally, the last 2 is from there, you've got rotation, okay, 7, and circumduction, which is 8. Okay, and I've defined all of those for you. Okay, right, now quickly, I just want to give you a few examples of the kinds of questions that apply questions that will come up in an exam. Now, just to go through a few of the obvious ones first, okay, you've got the squats. So if somebody's doing a squat, in the question you have to be very specific, okay? You have to say, so you've got the downward phase and you've got the upward phase. Now, if it's saying what movement is occurring there, so between there and there, that's the downward phase. So you would say in the downward phase of a squat, okay, the movements that are going on are, you've got, if you think about what joints are working, you've got the hip joint, the knee joint, and the ankle joint are working. Okay, so if you've got a squat going on, you've obviously got hip flexion happening there. Okay, so it's effectively the same as that, because the angle at this joint is reducing, so there's hip flexion. The angle at this joint here is reducing as well, so the knee joint, so there's flexion going on at the knee, okay, and the angle at the ankle joint is also reducing, so you have effectively dorsiflexion going on, okay, at the ankle joint. So in the downward phase of a squat, you have flexion at the hip, flexion at the knee, and dorsiflexion at the ankle. Now the upward phase, all the opposite occurs. Okay, so squat's quite easy really. You've only got flexion extension, okay, but taking into account dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. Now you've got on the upward phase, from there to there, okay, the angle at the hip joint has increased. That means that there's been hip extension. The angle at the knee joint has increased, which means there's knee extension going on, and the angle at the ankle joint has increased, which means there's plantar flexion going on. Okay, so that's a a squat. The same kind of thing would apply if you were doing a squat jump. So from there, okay, you hopefully you know mainly in the legs what kinds of movements that are occurring. Okay, if you have a press up, you might get a question about a press up. If you are doing the downward phase, okay, the joints that are working are the shoulder and the elbow, but you're more likely to be asked a question about the elbow. So on the downward phase, okay, that would be from here to there, that's called a downward phase, and the upward phase would be from there to there. Okay, now the downward phase, okay, the angle at the elbow joint is decreasing, so therefore that must be flexion. From the downward for the upward phase, the angle at the elbow joint is increasing, so that must be elbow extension. Okay, so for a press up, on the downward phase it's elbow flexion, on the upward phase it's elbow extension. Okay, next ones that you might get, you've got, let's have a look at some sporting ones. So tennis, this is potentially one that might, you know, sort of get you all. Tennis, if you're doing, again, if it's a skill, then talk specifically about what part of the skill. Okay, so that would be preparation, that would be execution, and that would be follow through. So you would have, for tennis for example, the kind of movement that would occur if for the execution of a ground stroke, okay, you would have that movement going on. Now straight away, if I just stand there and I do that, or even sort of that, you can see that hopefully the movement is happening at the shoulder. Okay, if I'm coming through like that, I'm almost sagittal now, sagittal plane. This is happening there at the shoulder, so hopefully you understand the angle at the shoulder is decreasing, so therefore you've got shoulder flexion going on. So a ground stroke, you have shoulder flexion going on. Okay, you could maybe even have a look at the fact that the arm's out there. So as you're playing the shot there, the arms come out. So the shoulder has actually, it's moved away. So that limb has moved away from the midline of my body. It's moved away from the midline of my body. It's moved out. So therefore you would have abduction of the shoulder going on. Okay, so for a ground stroke in tennis, you would have shoulder flexion, okay, and also a bit of shoulder abduction. Okay, shoulder flexion, shoulder abduction. All right. Another one that you might have, bowling in cricket. Okay, so if you get a question on bowling in cricket, that you might get a diagram side on. From there, it's coming, arms coming up and over. Okay, that would mean you've got rotational movement around a joint. Okay, or circular movement around a joint. That would be circumduction. Now that term there, you just need to try and remember. Circumduction. Okay, circumnavigate. Okay, means going around. Circumduction. Okay, so instead of abduction, adduction, circumduction. Okay, so you've got circumduction that goes on, and you've also got, like I said, as you let go of the ball, this happens. Okay, so that's what you call just rotation. Rotation is where there's movement happening around a longitudinal axis. Longitudinal axis is anything going down from the top of my head down towards my feet. The longitudinal axis. Okay, that's cricket. You could also have another one, throw-ins. Okay, for rugby or football, okay, you might get a question on what's the kind of movement that's going on for the throw-in. So preparation, execution, and follow through. So for the preparation, when bringing your arms back, you would have the angle at my elbow has decreased. So that means there's elbow flexion going on. Okay, the angle at the shoulder is decreased. That means there's shoulder flexion going on. So there's elbow flexion and shoulder flexion happening there. Okay. Now for the execution phase, okay, as I go to throw it, the angle at both of those joints is starting to actually increase. Okay, so the angle at the elbow joint is increasing, and the angle at the shoulder joint is now actually increasing as well. So you've got shoulder extension and elbow extension. Elbow extension, shoulder extension. That's the same for a rugby throw-in as well. Okay, so elbow extension on the execution part. Preparation is flexion, execution is extension. Okay, kicking, last one, kicking. Okay, we have, if you've got the foot, you'll get a diagram where the person starts like so, and then what will happen is, okay, they'll ask you what movements occurring during the execution phase of a kick. Okay, so it'll be there, okay, everything's there, hip extension, knee flexion, but what will happen now is I'm going to reduce the angle at the hip joint, okay, reduce the angle at the hip joint as I come to kick it. So that means there's flexion at the hip joint, I'm reducing the angle, okay, and then reducing the angle of the hip joint, and then I'm increasing the angle at the knee joint, which means now I've gone from 90 degrees to 180 degrees. Let's think about the angle being there, or the angle being there, the hip flexion. Angle being there for the hip, angle being the back of the knee for the knee. Okay, so for kicking, you start there, you get hip flexion, and you get knee extension on the follow through. Okay? Abduction, adduction. Okay, you might have other questions like, for example, swimming. The arms might come round and towards your body. So therefore you would have shoulder, you've got shoulder, well basically they're coming down and towards your side there. So that would be shoulder extension, shoulder extension. Okay, bring in there, and then also adduction to a certain degree, because the arms are coming towards the midline of the body. Okay, so adduction and shoulder flexion. Okay, so I'm gonna, as part of that, okay, you're gonna get some questions. I've got a PowerPoint to go over some of those things as well, just to clear them up. And really, to me, the important thing about this is just think to yourself, there's 8 different movements that go on. Think about them from the plane's perspective. So what movements would happen if I faced forwards? What movements could I see if I faced side on? And what movements could I see if the angle was from above? Okay. Hope this helps. Just make sure you know the 8 different ones. You know how to define them to a certain degree. And then also you know how to apply them to different sports. Okay. You know how to interpret what the movement is from point A to point B. Okay. Another thing, one more thing while I remember, is if you are able to sort of link some of your knowledge now. So say what kind of contractions occurring, concentric or eccentric, for the different phases. Say what muscle is the agonist and what's the antagonist. Okay, if you can start now linking all of these together, then you're actually you're building on all of your knowledge as you go along. Okay, right. Cheers.